Wonderful. Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for being with us here today. Welcome, Khushomaded, to this
Someone,
presentation on the recent research that Oxus Society has conducted on the armed forces of Central Asia. I would like to especially thank Michael Hilliard, um, who is the communications director and a research consultant at the Oxus Society, for putting together this project. This is the first of a series of chapters that examine the armed forces of Central Asia in the 21st century. So we have chapters coming out on the other four republics in the coming months, as Michael will outline. Many people have been involved in this project. At the beginning of the chapter, there's a long acknowledgement list of individuals and institutions who've helped collect and provide data and insights that have gone into this really rich and detailed analysis of the armed forces of Central Asia. Tajikistan, as we know, is the poorest country in the region, with the smallest defense budget, but also at the same time some of the gravest security challenges. It has the longest border in the region with Afghanistan, over 1,300 kilometers long. It's seen its citizens on a per capita basis join terrorist organizations abroad at a higher rate than neighboring republics, and obviously recently linked to a string of different terrorist attacks and plots in different parts of the world, from Russia to Turkey, Italy, Austria, and elsewhere. And so it's a country that has security challenges, and ultimately a military that, as the report outlines, despite having support from external partners, including Russia and China most particularly, has a military that is not prepared to meet many of these challenges. But with that, I'll hand over to Michael to talk about the broader project and to introduce the research and tell us some of its main takeaways. So thank you, Michael. Over to you.
Ed, it's always great. Yes, this project has been ongoing for almost a year now. Time flies, though. Effectively looking at building, what it came, I guess, at the very start of this was the fact that almost every other theater has a pretty comprehensive guide to the militaries, to the armed forces, to the security services. And it really is kind of Central Asia that is unfortunately kind of slipped through the cracks. And it's either mostly seen through a Russian perspective looking in, or it's kind of just left off the map for most defense and security analysis. So doing an analysis of all five republics and finding out what all the capabilities have, where they're coming from, what's changing, and effectively putting together an everything you need to know guide. And what originally was going to be probably 20 pages per chapter ended up, about 180 pages per chapter. Tajikistan was the very first one, and I think it was a fascinating one to look into, because not only is it a nation that has military facilities from the Chinese, from the from the Russians, from the Indians, but also had former French bases, had former American personnel stationed there as well. It is seen by so many as sort of the front line of Afghanistan, the fight against ISIS-K, as well as IS more generally. It's a changing defense sphere that has also had this massive upturning event of the war in Ukraine and sort of the economic outflows from there as well. So it's been fascinating to see how different things are, even just going back from 2020 to 2022 period. And then obviously one of the big factors, particularly in the Tajik and the Kyrgyz chapters, are the war in Batken. And effectively now there's this arms race going on between the two of them where they're trying to rearm and prepare. So the report goes through everything from the key moments in the history that effectively drove the country to where it is today, whether they be the Civil War, the wars and the fights in the Central Valley, Ghorab, but it also goes through the command structures. And each one of these countries, although relatively similar to what the old Soviet command system used to be, has this very odd differences that really do signify and give a really good idea about where the nation's going. And this is one of the reasons that I really like looking into defense procurement, one of my specialties in particularly defense economics, because whilst from government to government, from year to year, politics can change, things are on a whim. Anything with defense and security tends to be very long-term, very 10 years in the future. If you are buying a tank system, you're not committing to just having that tank system for the month. You're committing to using that for probably 10, 20 years and relying on the country you bought it from for gearboxes, parts, mechanics, everything you need going forward. It's a big commitment for anything you do with defense and security. So looking at these countries, you can see that there is this changing atmosphere on the ground. Every time I go to Central Asia at the moment, there is less Russian being spoken. There's more cultural changes on the ground, but in the defense and security sphere, not a lot is changing. It's almost completely bisecting from where we see culture going, which is really fascinating to watch the differences in these worlds. And then at the same time, you can see a whole bunches of trends where things like tanks, where there's a fixed cost, they already have tanks, they're not going to buy new ones. Everything is dominated by Russia still. But then you go to things like drones, where it's new, it's a pretty open market on where they buy from. And no, Russia has no foothold really in this region, apart from a few Orlan 10s and a few bits and bobs. That's another fascinating kind of long-term trend. Is goes when they can't keep slapping modernization kits on these old BMPs and old, Soviet armored vehicles and tanks, and they get to a point where they are with drones. Does that mean that Russia will probably be the turn away at that point? Looking at obviously the command structures, the Air Force, the navies, the ones that is more relevant, and then obviously we sat down with a few defense guys and a few think tanks, and effectively did some wargaming and looked at the kind of key scenarios, I guess, on what might happen in the region. So let's say a Tajik invasion of Kyrgyzstan, the reverse. What happens in a hypothetical Russian invasion of northern Kazakhstan? What happens in a naval combat on the Caspian Sea? And look at the sort of scenarios. What happens? What's the command structure? Who gets called? What the escalation signs would be to look for? And it's fascinating seeing some of the stress testing that these militaries go through. So I think the entire project is, including the mapping, which was also the fun one to do, is locate. I think it was 300 and something locations for Tajikistan. It's about 400 and something for Uzbekistan. I know it gets mind-boggling when you get to the bigger ones. Finding these locations, geolocating them, and then finding all the corroborating evidence of, social media posts that someone left up where they've taken a photo in their unit, whilst playing guitar in front of this statue that only appears at the base in Vos, and trying to pin all that together and work out effectively how these militaries work, because there just hasn't been a good. There's been some great historical studies done on this, but hasn't been any done, particularly since the invasion of Ukraine, and so much has changed in the region since both Ukraine and Bartkin. So it was fascinating to kind of put all this together. I see that Bart's dropped out for a bit. There he is. I'll try and bring him back in. But just while he comes on, happy to take another question if you want to. I think he's in as a panelist. There we go. He's back. Good timing.
Wonderful. Welcome back. But I was going to say that the research is very meticulous, as you say, and there is an interactive, as well as the report, right? There's this amazing interactive map and layered data set where you can kind of zoom in and locate different military installations, and it's really, really meticulous.
Well, that was
documented.
That was part of it to kind of give back to the Central Asia community as well, because I think there is. And I think a lot of people, when they think army, probably think very much like the American military, where you kind of think army as army. But when it comes to particularly Tajikistan, where there are, the mobile forces is different to the ground forces different to the border forces different to, you have these real distinctions. And yet, and a lot of newspapers and a lot of Western reporting, we tend to find that people just say Tajik army, when that actually it wasn't the Tajik army that had said that. So we hoped that, by putting all this out there and going, hey, look, the guys in this valley are actually, part of the Tajik border service, or, hey, these guys are actually part of the MIA service. It, helps everyone effectively have a resource they can go to. It gives them a lot of corroborating information. It goes, it makes sense why that torture report's for this, because their base is only just up the valley from here. Right. So that was part of it as well, to give back and give people kind of a central resource on these militaries.
Sure. And I think it's important, as we'll discuss later, we distinguish between these different units because they're under the control of different ministries, right? And one's under the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Ministry of Defense, the State Committee on National Security, all of which are controlled by different elite figures. And there's a lot of jockeying, as we'll discuss later. And there's a politics, of course, of both procurement and the amount of power that each of these units holds, because of course, there are various rivalries between different elite members, especially as we look towards transition, potentially from Rahman to his son, Rustam. We'll come back to that later, but I wanted to bring in Bakh Safarov, the founder of Central Asia Consulting and a native of Tajikistan himself, and who's written extensively on the politics of the country, on the security situation in the country. And the beginning of the report talks about the civil war, we know, Tajikistan is the only country in the region to have experienced a civil war. So I was wondering, Buck, if you can take us through why and how the civil war has shaped the military and the security apparatus within Tajikistan. To what extent is it important that the country had the civil war and then this period of peace and reconciliation, then ultimately, which has been dismantled more recently by the government?
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. I read through some of the report, and I think you guys did a wonderful job. And even starting analyzing this, I think it's tremendous work, and it's a very, very good start. And like Ed said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the political context of the situation in Tajikistan, because I literally, when all this happened, I was growing up as a teenager. I was in high school when the whole, independent movement started. So we used to go to those protests, see what's going on. It was very exciting time. And in order for analyze the whole situation and identify why Tajikistan became such a poorest country and why they has such a poor military, is to distinguish two main important factors that happen that causes all this. So I'm sure it will help you to analyze in case of war what will happen, knowing the political context of this conflict. So basically, we have to distinguish. There are two I would say groups that they started the war. So number one group was a group of free thinkers. It's like people who wanted to have certain autonomy and self-determination, which, during the later period of Soviet time, the Soviets let the people, because, for different reasons, people were starting thinking, they were identifying, they want more autonomy and free thinkers. And that, to be honest, that's what we were seeing, because there were different factions, different parties, different political organizations, different religions. It was amazing because I was witnessing this myself. And a second group, it was a group of system of Russian Empire / Soviet system that didn't want this whole happen. So you can see the whole system that Russians and Soviets applied in the former Soviet Union and the other states. They didn't want it to have any of those autonomies or any self-determination, which is a basic human psychology. Everybody wants to live autonomy so they can have, so they didn't want all of this. So they just want to suppress. And that's what happened. So, and that during that happened, so this system, we can call it, Soviets or Russian or whatever, they were starting to identify and blaming. First, they start blaming this group as a nationalist. So it didn't stick because they were like, that's not bad because we identify in a self, Then they call them Islamists. And it's like, oh, okay, so we are both Islam, where most of these people are. It didn't stick. So they were blaming, they were doing different, and then they end up being, so it's like, okay, so let's do them Islam, so Wahhabis. So they did, oh, these are Wahhabis. They call them Bolsheviks, it's like extreme. So they end up identifying some levels that dividing these groups. So when the whole conflict happened, they were trying to solve everything in a political, civilized manner because they were first election, political parties, parliament, everything going well. And then that's what happened is they said, oh, we can do that. And they literally prepared a plan that there is an evidence. You can research it on internet, which Russian military intelligence prepared. They have a plan to go and destabilize, and literally they made a military coup. They prepared these people that identified this group from a criminal. You can say that the main person who was leading the military uprising, which is Sangak Safarov, who was a criminal. We can go through the history and see that the Soviets, the communists, heavily relied on criminal organization when they did different stuff everywhere. And we can see even similar stuff which happening in Africa. When the mercenaries go and then do the whole thing. So we were actually part of this, that I was witnessing everything that happened. So when the whole military conflicts that happen and the people, start, using, because the arm was distributed to both sides and that military conflict erupted. So in this sense, because, we're a Muslim country, and if you take an arm, so you automatically, even for protect your civil rights, you automatically blame as Islamist, right? Islamist terrorist organizations. That's what the Russian propaganda was actually succeeded, blaming the all opposition who had to take arms to protect their own civil liberties as an Islamist. And even throughout your report, you can see that the fraction that was, flag of only Islamic flag and Islamic. Yeah, that happened, but that happened because people had to flee to Afghanistan. Afghanistan was this Islamic country, and all this, and they had that by default. They had to, some of the Islamic group, and then yes, they had made them to get some sort of religious attribute to the movement, which they end up, also calling, and some of the Islamist radical group were trying to get into the opposition party. So, in a nutshell, in '97, the opposition military, paramilitary forces were very effective fighting the government. And in 1997, they were literally, the groups were 20 kilometers away from the capital of Tajikistan. And that made force Tajik government with Russian, and other Central Asian countries that supported them to sign a peace agreement. That happened in June 27, 1997. So the main agreement was that the opposition will get 30% of the government, which at that time was around 5,000 personnel that will be in the government. But they end up having around 54 government position, and within the key ministries, they were about to get 16 positions. And over the years, so the whole people who were used to work, they got either killed, assassinated, or retired, or they just, were blamed with different framed, criminal charges, and they were removed from power. So this is a generally, it will be great if you do analysis that will actually help you, identify what kind of military these people will build, because they will build the military and security not to protect themselves, not to protect people and a real security, but it's going to be security that somebody else will tell them and control them to strengthen their own circle, to keep their own power. So this is from me, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer you questions.
Thanks, Buck. And just coming back to Michael, if you could talk us through some of the main units or facilities. Obviously, we know that Tajikistan is the country that hosts, as you said, forces uniquely from Russia and China, although China's never officially announced its presence. Oxus society researcher Bradley Jardine visited that facility back in the fall of 2022 and visited and saw that facility, and it certainly exists. So we can take us through some of the main facilities, some of the main units within the Tajik military.
And do. In fact, I will share a map so I can make it easier for everyone. Here we go. So effectively, let's take a look. Yeah, here we go. So you can see here are the main ground forces and mobile forces on a map together. Again, the ground forces are a much larger force. It's going to contain much more conscripts, much more really basic, kind of your basic everyday troops operating under the Ministry of Defense. Now, the mobile forces also operate under the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff, but they are actually pretty decent troops. A lot of, particularly the 7th, which is this unit here, just out to the west, to the east of Dushanbe and Tezgar, are some of the best fighters in anywhere throughout the country. In fact, the 7th are usually the guys you'd send to go do, let's say, CSTO operations, or really they can fight anyone effectively. What you can see here is a few things. One is that the forces up here in the north are actually much smaller than what they are down south. The 6th, which is a motor rifle brigade, is fairly small. It's not particularly well equipped compared to others. There is a separate mobile forces brigade up here, which is comparatively well equipped. And when you see them parade, you can really see the difference between the mobile forces and the ground forces. But generally, you can see that the majority of the actual kind of armed forces quantity-wise is going to be down here in Kolob, in Vos, in Dangara, around Bokhtar. Those are where the majority of sort of the ground forces are. And that leads to a really interesting kind of conundrum in Tajikistan where, if I go back a map here, this is the existing train lines in the country. And that has a massive effect, particularly what we found during some of the wargaming phases in this is whilst, let's say, the team playing is, let's say, the Uzbeks, if we go back here, have really good access to train lines. They can move gear around. If the troops start running out of ammunition, well, they can start bringing in ammunition from other places across the country. The Tajik teams always had a really difficult time bringing anything around the country, particularly moving anything, from north to south, because it is just extensions of the Uzbek train lines. And that has massive economic problems and economic impacts as well, because with no access to sea, the trains are obviously going to take a big part of the how goods get in and out of the country. But if we go back to our map here, looking at the forces, the guys in the capital are almost always effectively the really, really close to the president, the National Guard, which again only answers to the president. The 7th, which are effectively the best units inside Tajikistan, and a couple of just kind of recon units right to the east, more towards Vedat. There's some engineering units, there's some medical units, there's some peacekeeping forces that the US set up a base for. But generally, they make sure that the only big players inside the capital are some of the MIA forces, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the 7th, and the National Guard, which is really interesting to see that where the main defenses are around the capital. And where the best units are around the capital, but only units that Rahman particularly has made big influences on who their commanders are. So he personally picks the head of the National Guard. The 7th has been in there for a very long time, and Rahman makes very good knowing of who is in charge of the 7th, making sure they're very loyal to the government. So he's taken great lengths to make sure that the only units, really, really good units, are right near the capital. Everywhere else, your older equipment, your older units, your majority of conscripts are probably going to get pushed out to either some of the guys near Khojand, or they're going to get pushed down to some of the guys in the Hatlon Oblast. Out here, you can see that effectively, we can talk about the border forces afterwards, but when it comes to the Ministry of Defense actually has very little assets out here in Gorabadakhshan. They've actually almost completely left the defense of this area, at least for now, to a few very small offshoot units in Horog, a couple of very offshoot units in Morgob, and everything else is left to the MIA and the border forces, which is also really fascinating. But generally, that's where the layout of the country is. Everything, Air Force, air defense, troops, good fighting units, everything is pretty concentrated around the west of the country.
The border forces are under the State Committee for National Security. So I wonder if, Buck, you can tell us a little bit about the rivalries between some of these different elites and ministries, especially as we're looking towards a potential transition.
We can actually, it's very good analysis, because like you're saying, everything is built around Rahman keeping in power. But from what we analyze and what we see, there is a really, really certain rivalries that happen throughout the years. Because what happened is, during the Civil War, we could tell that there was like mainly the Ministry of Defense. They had some commanders like Ghafor Mirzoyev and all these guys. At that time, the more power was given to Ministry of Defense. Once the consolidation happened, so we could see that Ministry of Internal Affairs, as was Surab Qasimov, 3502, under Ministry of Internal Affairs, they were giving more power. So because the whole military were kind of, it was just taking too much power. So he was concentrating on Ministry of Internal Affairs. So when the Ministry of Internal Affairs dismantled the Ghaffur Mirzoev and all military Ministry of Defense, they were actually warlords at that time. So and then Zurab Qasimov with 3502, this military brigade, which was very effective on countering those, and they also participated in a war. And so and then after that, they also created a new unit under Langariev's brothers. So it's Faisali and Bakhtior. They were put against 3502 brigade. So they were actually able to dismantle them. So when that happened, so all more power came into between rivalries between Ministry of Internal Affairs and the two factions of this motorized brigades. And then after that, the security actually came to power when they gave more forces to national security, which at that time Abdurrahimov was. So then he pushed, then Yatimov came. So right now, there is a faction, right now is more of a national security and the general prosecutor. So now the general prosecutor is giving more power right now to curb this whole situation. So we don't know how right now they're balancing this. So between national security and general prosecutor's office. So that's right now they go during the transition. So it'll be good to see who is going to be next from this all law enforcement agencies who will be actually in charge of, sort of checking all this checks and balances between these power institutions.
Sure. And of course, Yusuf Rahman, who's not related by blood to Imam Ali Rahman, married one of his sons to Rahman's youngest daughter. And so he's managed to become part of the extended family in that jockeying for position. But certainly, as you say, we can see, quite a fractured elite under Rahman, but of course question marks as to when transition does occur. What will happen in terms of that infighting within the elite. So thanks for that great context. And speaking of these different scenarios, at the end of the report, you map out certain, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, Michael, the report maps out different scenarios. There's invasion, an incursion from Afghanistan. There's a border conflict with Kyrgyzstan. Can you talk us through a little bit about how you came up with those scenarios and how you evaluated the ability of the Tajik security forces to respond, or armed forces to respond to those theoretical crises?
Can indeed. I will share some maps again. And yeah, while I bring this up, you're very right about the theory 3502. It's a massive MIA unit, a mountain motor rifle unit, which still has huge political influence compared to other, MIA units. You look at, let's say, the 3502, which is just in the north, like if you go kind of about 10, 15 Ks north of Dushanbe, it's got a massive brand new modern facility that keeps getting money chucked at it. But then you look at its kind of sister units of 3501, 3503, and 3505. And all of them have, nowhere near as nice a facility. They're quite small. They're not nearly as funded. And speaking with guys who, are still in the MIA, the 3502, even just the facilities for its own soldiers are much nicer comparatively to the rest of them. So there still is this kind of, even that units that should be almost identical, that should be roughly the same, there is still political influence on who gets what equipment and where you are and how nice the position is. Politics really does seep into, long-term basing plans. Yeah. So back to the actual question though. So as part of the study, we effectively looked at, a few scenarios. So what we did is we sat down, worked out what each side has, it took a very long time to find all the units, find out what the capabilities are, how the commands respond, what the chain of command would be. And then sat down with a few organizations, some we can say, some we can't for obvious reasons, and effectively played two teams off against each other and originally found that, there's a few things that are really interesting. For one, you actually have to bend the parameters of the wargaming so far away from reality to make it work. To what we found particularly was if we have, let's say, this many troops, so in this scenario, we effectively have a brigade move up toward the border near Butkin and prepare for the attack. But what we found is every time we put that as a realistic scenario, Russia, China, someone discovers the brigade too quickly and puts massive political pressure on Tajikistan to stop. Because you got to remember that the last time this conflict happened, it was the border forces that effectively were fighting each other. And the border forces are, in fact, I'll go back and quickly just pull up a chart. I love chart. So you can see here that the border forces are, well, the Tajik Border Service only answers to the State Committee for National Security, which only answers to the President of Tajikistan. It's actually completely separate from the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff. So during the sort of the 2022 events, what we found, speaking to guys who worked for the Tajik Ministry of Defense, is that a lot of these guys didn't know how big the escalation was or what was going on the border with Bartkin, because it was the border forces doing this. So which means that, yes, these border force clashes can happen really quickly and without the command or pre-knowledge of the Ministry of Defense. But it also means that you move any Ministry of Defense assets, so tanks, vehicles, large objects out there, that immediately it raises red flags with everybody in the region, because people would go, well, why are you putting tanks and heavy vehicles out there in the capacity you would need to do an invasion? So we had to write this caveat into it to go, hey, no one discovers these tanks are going to be here. And that was a huge, pretty much kills it right there. But, so far we played it, and we played it a billion different times. Actually, I think we played about 8 times in different slight parameters to see, what reactions would be. But effectively, even in the best case scenario where we get, where the Tajik can by surprise take Bartkin, which we think these days is a pretty big ask considering the massive amount of money, spending, equipment, and capacity that the Kyrgyz have been putting into Bartkin in the last 2 years. Now you're stuck in this really bad position where that pretty much blows through most of the Tajiks' abilities to supply, to keep themselves going. And again, one of the things that people kind of forget about when you do any war planning or war gaming is, how good your soldiers fight is great. That's, having great troops is a good thing, but keeping them fed, clothed, with ammunition, with food, with fuel, and everything you're going to need to bring in just absolutely causes problems. And particularly when you start factoring in things like the Kyrgyz being able to use their drones in this area, because it's actually within range of the Jalalabad drone units, which becomes really problematic really quickly for the Tajik forces. And what you end up pretty quickly is with these kind of, even if they can seize the bridges and get really, quite far in, again, this is quite a small battlefield actually comparatively, but you end up with a problem where the commanders have to either hold Butkin and then get Isfarar taken away and the supply lines cut, or they can try and push back, and you just absolutely end up in huge problems because the Tajik forces are really not designed for long campaigns, or they have to retreat back in and give up all of their gains effectively at about day 6, day 7 to achieve very little politically. In fact, it will actually hurt them politically as well. So it really doesn't make sense for the Tajiks to try for a massive invasion of Batken, because in a realistic scenario, political pressure is applied to say, don't do this. And even if you can give that caveat and say, they do go in there undiscovered, they manage to get across the line, they start having problems like not enough refueling stations, not enough mobile repair stations, not enough trucks to just keep gear coming in from Isfara. It becomes really, really problematic very quickly. And as well as the point that a lot of this Tajik equipment is very, very old. And I think a lot of people kind of don't think about the little differences, like the condition of a tank's gearbox. A lot of the Tajik's tanks are quite old, T-72B1s, where the tank gearbox is perfectly fine for a parade ground and perfectly fine for a training exercise. But when you're a Tajik private and you're panicking and you're being shot at and you're not really thinking clearly, you're just going to jam it in reverse as fast as you can go. And that's really quickly going to snap most of the gearboxes. There are problems that just stack up really quickly. And we found that whoever was playing the Tajik side, they can have a pretty good day 1 and they can have a pretty good day 2. But from day 3, supply problems start coming in. You start getting put into these really hard choices of, do you try and put all your trucks in the one place so they're easy to repair and you can cannibalize trucks for parts, but then you make it so vulnerable to Kyrgyz drone strikes? Or do you try and keep all the trucks apart, but now it becomes twice as hard to repair anything? Just so many little tough choices like that we had to play we'll play a different version where they do keep them together, and we just end up in a horrible, horrible situation again. And then we'll play them, where they don't, and we still end up in pretty bad situations. It was a somewhat comforting move at the end to go, if I were advising the Tajik government, I would advise absolutely no way, do not do this. This is nowhere near, this is not going to end well and has really no, almost no chance of this being successful. And then again, when we play the Kyrgyz side, so the Kyrgyz going to invade the Tajiks, exactly the same thing happens. They actually get to about here and they start having real problems really quickly. It is interesting, kind of the massive takeaway from all this is that all their militaries have got some good bells and whistles. They've got pretty good ability to defend themselves if they were attacked, but to go and actually invade one of their neighbors, they've got very little in the way of capacity to do that. So it's almost built into these long-term problems that they really aren't looking. It's almost built in that they're not going to be invading their neighboring states anytime soon.
That's a comforting thought, and hopefully the reports are read within the capital cities of Central Asia. I'm going to throw this open to questions from the audience at this point. If you have a question, please feel free to type it in the Q&A box. If not, I'll ask another question quickly to both our panelists. That's related to the geopolitics of Tajikistan's security assistance. Obviously, we've talked about bases. Can you talk a little bit more about arms suppliers, and what kind of where is Tajikistan's armed forces getting its military hardware? We know a lot of it is still Soviet era, but we can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I can talk about that for a bit. Effectively, just going to remove pin from there. There we go. Perfect. So I'll go back to my charts again. Yes, effectively, there is a huge kind of interest in all of the equipment is really, really old. You are very correct in that one. A lot of it's going to be BTR 60s, BTR 70s, BTR 80s, lots of old BMPs. A lot of stuff that was built in the Soviet Union probably in the 1960s and 70s. In fact, when we look at, bring up a chart. Yeah, when we're looking at, let's say, the total amount of vehicles that are run by the Tajik military, Russia and the USSR are very much still the dominant players here. What we are seeing, though, is, but you can also see that there's lots of little bits of equipment that they use from specialty sources. And it seems to be that Russia is the guy they go to for their day-to-day, their bread and butter, what they need to get functioning. But when they want, short burst communication systems, when they want drones, when they want high-tech EW warfare stuff, when they want, even some of the sort of more specialized units have rifles that are not made in Russia. They kind of don't look at Russia for the very specialized stuff. We found that absolutely fascinating because that's a trend we do see across, most of the Central Asians. Russia is probably going to be the supplier for a very long time. And there was this weird bump in 2022 where China really took over the market. But most of that, I think, people maybe overshot and overjudged how long-term that would be. Most of that probably just being a reaction to Russia requiring all of its equipment for the war in Ukraine. The price of Russian exports went absolutely skyrocketing because obviously Russia didn't have enough arms and ammunition to go around. The richer states who still rely on Russian equipment, so India, Kazakhstan, those kind of guys, bought the market out and can afford to pay much more than the Tajiks could. So we do see this kind of price go up. Tajik has to turn to China for about a year and a half. And then now the price has gone back down because Russia's manufacturing capacity for arms has now reached a point where it can supply the war and effectively supply the export market as well. We have seen Tajikistan pretty much revert back to Russia, but not all the way. There is a few odds and ends, particularly in some of the, some light mortars and a few other bits and pieces where the Tajiks seem to have gone, maybe the Russians aren't the way to go for this. Which obviously that's a big move and something that Russia will be a bit annoyed about. But still, to get the Tajiks off the Russian equipment will take a very, very, very long time. Even though they have got all these different arms partners, you can still hear from the pie chart that it is just, absolutely the major player in this arms industry. Any sort of comments on this, Seth?
There are some questions coming in but I can direct a back to your first, which are related to the Pamir region. There's a question about the ability of the Tajik forces, be they from the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Internal Affairs, security services, to control, project power in that region. So what is their capacity? And then there's another question about the importance of the Horog-Dushanbe road, and China's role in recently, well, not recently, in continuing the upgrade of that road. How does that affect the ability to project power? So lots of questions. I'll throw to Buck first, and then turn over to Michael.
Sounds good.
Oh, yeah. So this is a great question, and if we look at what you describe in your scenarios, it almost makes it impossible to go one country go get to another country. I think when the Soviets designed the whole Soviet Union, I think they did take into consideration, those countries, in case they want to invade each other, they'll make it really difficult. I might be wrong, but if you go and look at the terrain where they put the borders, so they did it specifically, which will be almost very difficult. And if you go back and look at the conflicts, there maybe happened a couple of conflicts. Yeah, Azerbaijan and Armenia. And, that was made it really difficult. So if any of the countries want to think about invading other country, they would know that logistically and all terrains will make it very expensive and very inefficient and almost in a certain point impossible. And the same thing with Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast, because it's such a terrain area. I think that was, we understand that we, Pamiris have distinct and we have different languages. That's why they give it a certain autonomy. Because in any case, is let's say if because that's what happened during the Soviet time, when during the independence and civil war, Tajikistan central government couldn't invade fully Badakhshan because of the terrain, because of logistics, because of that. If we look at this, and the only reason why government was able to grasp this all, Gorno-Badakhshan, because the people of Gorno-Badakhshan eventually understood, listen, we don't fight Rahmon here, we find ordinary people. And that's when they start, stop using weapons and test who we're going to eventually kill. We're going to kill, all Tajiks, which, they really felt sense of, one nation, and they just gave up all armed resistance. So if in a scenario, if let's say we Pamiris and all people of Gorno-Badakhshan decide that they're going to go take arms, that will be almost impossible for government to control. If we go back, and they know it. That's why when they pre-planned taking over the Badakhshan, they knew they won't be able to do it themselves. And 2012, they went to Russia. Putin said, hey, it's also expensive for Russians to go invade the conflict. They said no. That's when Rahmon turned his eye to China. That's when you see the first really close cooperation with Tajikistan and China started after 2012. There was a literally demonstration of Chinese military vehicles. They came through the border all the way to they crossed through the entire Pamir highway all the way to Kalaykhum, and then went back, and they were stationed in Horog airport where they showed the military. They went purchase some of the items from Horog market, and then they left. And now we see that there are a couple of military bases around Gabao. So for Tajikistan, for Tajik government itself, it's impossible. But now, as China steps in, that will be practically impossible for, even let's say decide the people of Pamir get really fed up and start insurgency. It's going to be impossible now because, China is strong. They have all capabilities. They won't be able to do anything. So to answer your question, yes, Tajikistan, with the assistance of China, will be able to grasp power, and that's going to be very dangerous actually for people of Pamirs, because it's not going to end well, because people who used to live in a freedom and certain autonomy with their own distinction with languages, they just won't be able to survive, like psychologically. Like imagine if you're not allowed to speak your language, nothing. So eventually we end up being as a Toshkurgan when you see Pamiris in Tashkurgan in China, which, they're about, very small amount of people that remain. And they have all relocation program that they use to relocate people from, Toshkurgan, which is in China, to different part of China, which eventually they will disappear. So that's where we're standing right now. Instead of roads, so that's, I think that will answer your third question. The question in routes. I mean, once government has a control, they're building all this road infrastructure, and there are a couple of large projects that we just witnessed. They just signed a new grant that will be the Murgab. They're going to have some mineral excavation that will range from Murgab all the way to Jirgatol Lash, which is it's a 10 million feasibility project. They already allocated money. So this is all going to be about resources. And I don't think it's even at that long term is going to end up well for Tajik government itself. So that's my prediction.
Thanks, Michael, if you have anything to add. You're on mute.
I do indeed. Let me share my screen once again. So we actually did I'm just going to bring up a copy of the report here because we have all the maps in the one place. So we actually did a full study of, what the military's capacity is out here in Gorda Badakhshan. The study effectively looks at a theoretical kind of IS, Islamic State group, whether it's ISK or just someone IS affiliated, invading Horog. We think that's absolutely not in the possibility of what IS can do at the moment. But for us, it was more about effectively showing, hey, if Horog was to fall, whether it's the protesters, IS, anybody, what is the capacity of the Tajik government to respond to that crisis? Because it absolutely stress tested and revealed a huge bunch of problems that come from this. The first one being, so obviously we have this scenario here where ISKP lines on the other side of the river. They cross the river and seize effectively the airport, which is here, and there is I can zoom in a bit. Look at that. These two bases here are MIA and State Committee of National Security bases, so border forces. There's a very, very small amount of mobile guys in here, but they're not really. They're mostly just kind of like offshoots of of the 3505, which is now in Hulob. But what we found is even if they can get a really good run of it, so they managed to capture local armed stepos, they managed to take the bases, pretty much unopposed, which again we think is way beyond the possibility. The logistical problems out here are really, really, really difficult because the roads are, effectively tiny, very, very choke pointy. We had massive problems with the team that was playing, the invading side could, if they really wanted to, do a couple of things like attack dam infrastructure, particularly the guys upstream from Horog, or they could go effectively park themselves up and down the roads and just try and get hold of particularly some very old dushkas or really old armor piercing rounds and cause some pretty bad problems. You also hit massive problems like what we can see on the screen here, which is the current drones or capacity that Tajikistan probably has access to, which effectively would be whatever the Abadil 2s, which they're making on behalf of the Iranians, or Orlan 10s that have been handled by the Russians. You can see how much airspace they can actually cover, which means they have no ability to have any aerial reconnaissance. They can't look above Horog. They can't actually fly into Horog. It becomes really difficult. In fact, the only way they can effectively get aerial drones over the target is by bringing in Orion 10s, Orion Es from Russia, basing them out of Aini and flying them in. Even then, you can see it's right on the edge of what these drones are actually capable of. So you end up having huge problems again, where they get there, they're over the target for 20, 30 minutes and they go home again. And if you were going to even get Horog up and running, as we kind of talk about in the report, it would take a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort. And even then you really don't get that much extra capacity. Horog is a particularly kind of dangerous spot in the middle there. It's quite difficult to fight in. And even if you manage to get all the way down here, we found it most of the time, it's like a 3 to 4 day window before the government can respond in kind. What they have been doing is effectively bolstering the MIA and the border forces that are in Horog. There's a big border guard training school there at the moment that will obviously help with the defense if it was an incursion. Because again, we don't think an incursion of this level could happen at this current time. But we have seen this kind of phase out of the Ministry of Defense in there. And from what we understand, what seemed to be happening is that they put conscripts into Horog, and they'd be often, because they never tend to deploy you near your house. So you get guys from Khojan, you get guys from Dushanbe, and then they get drunk and they punch the locals, and it would cause tensions. Whereas I tend to find that on the, as a very broad general statement, the guys who are MIA or specialist forces tend to be a bit better behaved. So they've gone with smaller numbers, rapidly reacting, but slightly better behaved because it's less likely to start punches with the locals and hopefully at that point, avoid a conflict between the two sides. China is probably the most interesting player out of all of these. Russia effectively has the massive 201st base. In fact, give me 2 seconds. I'll go up in the report and bring the maps up. So this is the Russian base at the 201st. So this is in Dushanbe. It's a huge base. It is the largest base outside the Russian Federation. That's usually, we used to have about 7,000 troops. It's down to about 3,500 at the moment. But that's mostly just because they've been pulled away for Ukraine. They have also got this base here in Bokhtar. Again, it's got about a regiment sitting in it and a bit more. Not bad. It's just good to be in the south bit. Aini is effectively got a number of Russian aircraft and air assets. It's where the Russians used to operate out of, or at least the Russians still operate out of. The Indians did help refurbish it at one point, but have been kicked off. You also have things like the Laya Proving Ground. Russia also has a bunch of S-300 missiles that are currently there for the Joint Air Defense System. Okno, which is the space center as well. And this is all kind of standard Russian stuff. This is not that different from what Russia's capacity in the country has been for a very long time. It's a little bit withdrawn effectively from 2012, 2015 period. We saw the Russians pull back from Kolob and a few other places, but it's still pretty much where the Russians have been for a while. China's the real interesting player, and Brad's been out here, which is really interesting. But this is the big Chinese facility. It was originally joint with the Tajiks. It's now just the Chinese facility. But what the Chinese have done is they keep saying the no military presence in Tajikistan, which is technically true because this is not a military facility. It's a Chinese PAP, or People's Armed Police facility. So technically it's similar to how the Tajiks use the MIA. It's actually it looks quite menacing because people look at photos of it. Its capacity is quite small. It's only about 300-ish soldiers at it, and most times, most of these vehicles are Chinese made. They haven't got lots of armor. They haven't got massive refueling capacity. They haven't even got large amounts of ammunition and storage sitting around as well. That kind of, when we're looking at this Horog scenario, we've like, hey, well, how would the Chinese respond to this? And from China experts we spoke with, the consensus seems to be they don't. They would either talk with the Russians or offer assistance or keep an eye on their part of the country. But frankly, if we look at the location, if Horog is right here, the Chinese facility is all the way out here. It's almost as difficult, if not more difficult, to get from here to here. Because again, at least when you're coming from Dushanbe out to Horog and you're using the Horog road, you do have some of these middle towns like Roshan that you can, refuel a bit or you can gather supplies at. With China, there is not that much between their positions near Kizarabot and where they are in Horog. So, what we do find really interesting is China is effectively having this backlash from Pakistan that is absolutely affecting how they do things here in Tajikistan. People who aren't aware, China had built some massive facilities in Pakistan in the very early stages of the Belt and Road, particularly around Gwadar. And they had this kind of problem start where the Chinese were better paid because it was a Chinese-run project. The locals didn't like it. The locals would target the Chinese workers there. The Chinese would respond by, shooting the locals who were trying to hurt them. That would agitate the locals. The locals would gather in bigger numbers, so the Chinese had to put more troops in. And you went up really quickly in this cycle. Whereas in the Tajik case, what they tend to do is they'll pay the actual, pay other people to effectively do the work for them. They don't want to be shooting Afghans. They don't want to be making a big security footprint here because they know that if they were to, let's say, go fire upon a few Afghans, that would only agitate more people from Afghanistan to come fire at them, and you end up in a cycle again, which could have massive blowback for Xinjiang as well. So what they tend to do is you have, this is the Chinese facility out here. They actually have, Tajiks kind of guarding the Chinese facility from the roads coming in, and they're just paying Tajikistan to do more. So we've already seen the Chinese who are funding a new rapid reaction force out here in just below, just south near Ishkakum. We've also seen the Chinese who are putting lots of money towards the border force, hoping that the Tajiks will effectively bolster their border force, and the border force will take care of the problems on the border, as well as the Chinese. They do have some private security in here. They do have some other stuff they want to do in here. It's all in the report. But what I find interesting is all this money, whether it's being chucked from BOMDAS, or whether it's being chucked from China, or whether it's being from Russia or the EU, to fund the Tajik border force so they can better control the area, is not stopping the flow of drugs. It does stop most of the flow of incoming from Afghans, but doesn't stop most of the drugs because there's way too much money to be made. And B, is going to one of the least accountable branches in the entire military, because whilst the Ministry of Defence and the Ministry of Internal Affairs have parliamentary oversight and Security Council oversight, because the border forces operate under the command of the SCNS, effectively what used to be the Tajik KGB, it means that all this money is going towards A, the same force that fought Kyrgyzstan recently, and B, that has no parliamentary accountability, which is a fascinating problem because it's the force that everyone's relying on to keep the border stable with Afghanistan. The very long-winded answer, but that generally we find that it's a very difficult to operate in Korog, very difficult to get there. If the other side really knows what they're doing, it becomes like a few weeks before we can actually get in there properly. But the Chinese are choosing almost a proxy way of operating in this region rather than the standard what Russia used to do out here, which is just patrol the border themselves.
Great, thank you, Michael. And we've come up against time, but thank you all for attending. The report is accessible on our homepage, oxussociety.org. You can access the report and you can access the interactive map and visuals that Michael's been presenting. And as we mentioned at the beginning, this is the first of 5 different reports. So we expect to be releasing those in the coming months. We'll send updates. We'll probably have further events like this and opportunities to engage with the broader community and generate a discussion around these really fascinating and in-depth research. So thank you all for coming. Pragmati Kalon to everyone who's here and attended, and those who are watching on YouTube. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.